You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
On the Occult Rejects, we only bring in figures who force a rethink of the whole project, who make you question where science ends and the sacred begins. Jabir ibn Hayyan made the cut because he is that crossroads. An orphan-turned-court physician, a disciple of Jafar al-Sadiq, who wrote like a philosopher and worked like a bench chemist. In his hands, the alembic wasn't just glassware, it was a lens of creation. He stitched Greek reason to Shiite esotericism, and he treated experiment as devotion, arguing that the world is ruled by balance, number, and hidden sympathies that the patient mind can weigh. That is why he is on the Occult Rejects. He embodies our core question. Can occult knowledge sharpen, not blur, the edge of science? Today we'll walk his path from Yemen and Kufa to Abbasid Baghdad into labs humming with furnaces and quiet prayer. We'll crack open the Great Book of the Mercy, the 70, and the 112. The books on the 7 metals then cross the threshold into talismans, specific properties, the veiled Book of the King, and the shadowed rumor of a book of black magic. We'll watch mineral acids bite metal, trace why the number 17 mattered in his science of balance, and follow his ideas as they jump languages, from Arabic manuscripts to the Latin Gerber who shaped European labs. If you ever wondered whether the Philosopher's Stone was a metaphor, a method, or both, this is your episode. Jabir ibn Hayyan, Arabic, often Latinized as Gerber, Geber, was an 8th century polymath renowned as the father of early chemistry. A deeply learned alchemist, pharmacist, astronomer, philosopher, and physician, Jabir lived in the cradle of the Islamic Golden Age and pioneered the experimental scientific method well before the modern era. Traditionally described as either Arab or Persian in origin, he grew up amid political turmoil and spiritual unrest. His legacy includes hundreds of writings on alchemy, mysticism, and science, the Jabirian corpus, which influenced both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Jabir's life and work offer a vivid window into the world of 8th century science, where mystical philosophy and laboratory experiment went hand in hand. Jabir was born around 721 CE in the town of Tus in Khorasan, northeastern Persia in modern Iran. His father, Hayyan al-Azdi, was a pharmacist by trade and a member of the Arab Az tribe who had immigrated from Yemen to Kufa in Iraq during Umayyad times. Hayyan became involved in the revolutionary politics of the age. He supported the Abbasid revolt against the ruling Umayyad Caliphate. In the years leading up to the Abbasids' victory, which occurred in 750 CE, Hayyan was sent east to Khorasan to muster support for the cause. This risky mission ultimately cost him his life. He was discovered by Umayyad authorities and executed around 725 CE, when Jabir was only a young child. With his father martyred for the Abbasid cause, Jabir's family fled for safety. According to accounts preserved by later writers, his mother took him back to Yemen, their ancestral land, after Hayyan's death. In Yemen, the boy Jabir grew up in the guardianship of Harabi al-Himyari, a notable local scholar. Under Harabi's tutelage, Jabir studied the Quran, Arabic literature, mathematics, and perhaps the rudiments of natural sciences. This early education grounded him in the Islamic faith and the classical knowledge of the time. We can imagine the young Jabir in the lush highlands of Yemen, learning geometry and scripture by day and hearing tales of far-off lands and hidden wisdom by night. These formative years gave him a thirst for knowledge and likely acquainted him with the ancient South Arabian tradition of alchemy and astrology, for Yemen had old connections to esoteric arts. When the Abbasid dynasty finally overthrew the Umayyads in 750 CE, the political climate changed dramatically. The new Abbasid rulers were more sympathetic to Shiite Muslims and to learned men like Jabir's father. With the threat from the Umayyads gone, Jabir, now a young man, traveled to Iraq, the heart of the Abbasid realm, to pursue his fortunes. He settled in Kufa, a city that was a center of Islamic scholarship. Kufa at this time was bustling with scholars of theology, philosophy, and science. It was here that Jabir's life would truly take shape. In Kufa, Jabir sought out the finest teachers of the age. He himself later named his teachers in his writings, allowing us to identify some of them. One was an enigmatic sage, known only as Udhun al-Himar al-Mantiki, Donkey's Ear the Logician, perhaps a nickname, who said to be a student of Marinus of Neapolis, a Neoplatonic philosopher. Through such intermediaries, Jabir may have absorbed elements of Greek philosophy and Hermetic lore, including Pythagorean and Platonic ideas that would surface in his work. However, by far the most influential mentor in Jabir's life was the Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. Jafar was a great-grandson of Prophet Muhammad and the sixth Shiite Imam, renowned for his deep knowledge in religious and worldly sciences. Jabir likely met Jafar in the early 760s in Kufa, where the Imam spent some time. Kufa was a stronghold of the Imam's followers. In Jabir's writings, he reverently calls Jafar my master and the source of wisdom, crediting him as the original source of all the knowledge he expounds. Indeed, Jabir's entire intellectual system is often presented as esoteric teachings from Imam Jafar, conveyed through an unbroken chain of transmission. Under Jafar's guidance, Jabir delved into religious philosophy, alchemy, and the natural sciences, gaining a unique blend of spiritual and scientific training. This apprenticeship not only honed Jabir's intellect but also rooted him in Shiite Islamic thought, a key to understanding his later writings. Jabir's educational journey likely also included study of medicine. Some accounts say he went to the city of Medina at one point, perhaps accompanying Imam Jafar, and there learned medicine and pharmacy, a logical path given his father's profession and his own later expertise in medicinal chemistry. Another tradition claims Jabir briefly studied with the Umayyad prince Khalid ibn Yazid, sound familiar? Who is reputed to be an alchemy enthusiast a generation earlier. Regardless, by the time he was an adult, Jabir ibn Hayyan had acquired a formidable education for his era. He was well versed in Islamic theology, philosophy, languages, natural science, and alchemical lore, both Islamic and pre-Islamic. Around the year 755 CE, Jabir would have been in his mid-30s, ready to contribute to the Abbasid intellectual renaissance. The Abbasids had shifted the empire's capital from Damascus to Baghdad, founded in 762, and although Kufa was close enough to benefit from Baghdad's rise, the real opportunities lay in the capital. Jabir's talents soon caught the attention of the Abbasid court. He began practicing as a physician in Kufa, treating the sick and perhaps preparing medicines, which gave him practical experience with chemicals and herbs. His reputation grew, and he gained a powerful patron in the form of the Barmakid family. The Barmakids were a wealthy Persian-descended clan who served as grand viziers, chief minister, to the caliph and were famous patrons of the sciences. Sometime in the 770s, he moved his base to Baghdad, the glittering city of peace, to work more closely with the court. There, the Barmakids provided him with the resources to conduct research. It's said that Jabir had a well-equipped laboratory in which he could carry out experiments in alchemy and chemistry. He also had access to the House of Wisdom and other libraries where Greek and Syriac manuscripts were being translated into Arabic at the caliph's behest. In fact, later lore claims that Caliph Harun al-Rashid commissioned the translation of Greek scientific works at Jabir's suggestion to aid in Jabir's research. While this cannot be verified, it underscores Jabir's perceived importance at court. By 776 CE, Jabir was reportedly already renowned enough in Kufa that historical notes indicate he was engaged in alchemy there at the time. This suggests that even before moving fully to Baghdad, Jabir was conducting experiments and perhaps writing down some of his early treatises. We might picture Jabir during this period as a dynamic figure. During the day, serving as a court physician and healer, maybe even treating the callous family or the nobility, and by night, retreating to his workshop to heat and distill substances in pursuit of alchemical transformations. He was one of the first to apply an experimental, methodical approach to these investigations, in contrast to the more recipe and ritual-based alchemy of predecessors. Jabir's life, however, was not destined to remain in royal favor permanently. His fortunes were tied to the Barmekins, and this family's fate took a sharp turn. In 803 CE, Caliph Hayyan fell prey to court intrigues and abruptly disgraced and destroyed the Barmekids, an event that shocked the empire. The vizier Jafar al-Barmeki was executed and his relatives imprisoned or exiled. With his powerful patrons gone, Jabir's position became uncertain. Sources indicate that he was placed under house arrest in Kufa around this time. The reasons are not entirely clear. Possibly the caliph's officials feared that Jabir, with his esoteric knowledge and Barmekid connection, could be dangerous or disloyal. It is testament to Jabir's stature that he wasn't executed outright, as some Barmekid associates were, but rather confined. Thus, in his later years, Jabir lived in relatively obscurity back in Kufa, reportedly under surveillance, yet seemingly still devoted to scholarship. Despite these setbacks, Jabir continued writing and teaching until the end of his life. He died in Kufa circa 815 CE, during the reign of Caliph al-Mamun. He would have been in his 90s, a remarkably long life for that epoch, which adds a legendary aura to his story. By the time of his death, Jabir ibn Hayyan had already slipped partly into the realm of legend. Interestingly, no contemporary biographies of Jabir were written while he lived. The first biographical notes about him appear in the 10th century, well after his death. This has led some historians, both medieval and modern, to question aspects of his life. Nonetheless, the hundreds of treatises bearing his name began to circulate widely, ensuring that Jabir the scholar would be remembered for centuries. Medieval bibliographers like Ibn al-Nadim cataloged Jabir's work and noted the astonishing range of subjects they covered. A few skeptics in the 10th century even whispered that Jabir might never have existed, that the name was a pseudonym. But Ibn al-Nadim and others rejected this, insisting that such a scholar did walk the earth. Indeed, Jabir's contemporaries may have overlooked him, but history would not. Whether penned by one man or compiled by a school of followers, the writings attributed to Jabir form the most extensive alchemical literature of the Islamic world. In later Islamic references, Jabir was said to have authored hundreds of books, by one count, over 3,000 treatises. While modern scholars doubt that one individual could have written so many, about 215 works still survive under Jabir's name, indicating a massive corpus even in distilled form. These works, often called the Jabirian corpus, cover not only alchemy and chemistry, but also magic, astrology, medicine, philosophy, and even grammar. It is as if Jabir aimed to encapsulate all knowledge of his time within a grand encyclopedia of esoteric wisdom. Within the corpus, several major collections of texts can be distinguished, each with its own focus and flavor. Here we will cover some of Jabir's most important works and collections, with a brief overview of their content. The Great Book of Mercy. This was considered by the scholar Paul Krauss to be the oldest work in Jabir's corpus. It is a comprehensive alchemical manual and perhaps Jabir's foundational text. The title, Book of Mercy, reflects Jabir's stated motivation for writing it. In the introduction, he expresses pity for those alchemists who seek to make gold by fraudulent shortcuts or ignorance. I have seen people giving themselves over to the search for the art of transmuting gold and silver in ignorance. They are of two classes, the deceivers and the deceived. I am filled with the feelings of mercy and compassion for them, because they waste their money which God has given them and weary their bodies in a fruitless search, he writes. Jabir explains that out of Rahma, compassion, He decided to lay out the alchemical art clearly so the sincere seekers would not be fooled by charlatans. Fittingly, this work gives relatively straightforward descriptions of materials and processes. It was significant enough that the great chemist Al-Razi later wrote a commentary on it, now lost, and it was one of the Jabirian works translated into Latin in the 13th century. The Katib al-Rama thus stands as an early cornerstone of Jabir's legacy, a text intended to guide and save aspiring alchemists from folly. Then we have the 112 books. This is a collection of 112 short treatises that function like chapters in a large handbook. Each treatise deals with a different practical aspect of alchemy, often framed as an explanation of the symbolic riddles left by ancient sages. A prominent theme across these is the use of organic materials in alchemy, plant and animal substances, not just minerals. For example, one treatise might explain how to derive a certain elixir from herbs, another from blood or hair. The theoretical underpinning here is similar to the classical four-element theory. Jabir reduces bodies to the elements: fire, air, water, earth, and those to the four elementary natures: hot, cold, moist, and dry. However, in the 112 books, the exposition is less systematic and more expository than in Jabir's later works. The instructions read as practical recipes with measured quantities and step-by-step guidance, more cookbook and less philosophizing, indicating these texts were meant to teach experimentation. Interestingly, the collection opens with the Book of the Element of the Foundation, a treatise which even continues an Arabic version of the legendary Emerald Tablet of Hermes, bridging Hermetic lore with Jabir's own teachings. All in all, the 112 books portray an alchemist busy in the laboratory deciphering ancient secrets and trying myriad techniques. Then we have the 70 books. The Book of 70 is perhaps Jabir's most famous set of writings. Unlike the 112 books, the 70 books are highly organized into a single opus. They are divided into 7 parts, each containing 10 treatises, hence 70 in total. The structure covers the full spectrum of Jabirian alchemy. The first 3 parts deal with preparing the alchemical elixir from each of the 3 kingdoms of nature. 1 part on animal, derived ingredients, 1 on vegetable, 1 on mineral. 2 parts are devoted to the classical 4 elements, 1 theoretical, 1 practical. The remaining 2 parts focus on detailed techniques for using specific animal substances and specific metal substances in the art. Together, the 70 books present a systematic exposition of Jabir's alchemical theory, with each treatise building on the previous. This collection was highly regarded in later centuries. It was translated into Latin by Gerard of Cremona in the 12th century, bringing Jabir's ideas to European scholars. Medieval Latin alchemists quoted the Book of 70 extensively. Even the 13th century pseudo Gerber, who wrote his own influential alchemical text under Jabir's name, was familiar with the mutilated Latin version. In a sense, the 70 books represent Jabir's magnum opus as an alchemical teacher, a complete course from fundamentals to advanced practice. Following the 70, Jabirian lists mention an appendix of the 10 books added to the 70 and another separate set called the 10 books of rectifications. Only fragments of these survive. One surviving text, the Book of Clarification, critiques other philosophers for focusing only on minerals and neglecting plant and animal methods for the elixir. Another fragment, the Book of Rectification of Plato, is intriguing. It's written as if Plato's understanding of alchemy is being corrected, and it enumerates various multi-step operations using mercury and other medicines. These rectification books suggest Jabir engaged in a bit of an intellectual game, retrospectively crediting Greek luminaries like Pythagoras, Socrates, Homer, and Aristotle with alchemical contributions, then adding his own improvements in their voice. It reflects his desire to link his science to a venerable ancient tradition while still asserting that his knowledge surpassed that of the ancients. And next, we have the Books of the Balances. This is a large collection of 144 treatises which mark a shift to a more philosophical and universal approach. Here, Jabir applies his science of the balance to a vast array of topics. The extant balance treatises, 79 are known by name, 44 survive, cover not just alchemy but also cosmology, music theory, medicine, logic, metaphysics, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and grammar. In each domain, the idea is to reduce phenomena to a quantitative balance of fundamental properties. For example, a balanced treatise might attempt to quantify the temperament of humors in medicine, or the tuning of musical notes, or the grammatical properties of language, all using a unified scale of values. This was Jabir's grand philosophical vision, that all existence is structured by measure, weight, and number, an almost Pythagorean or proto-scientific outlook. Notably, in these treatises, Jabir also makes cryptic allusions to the appearance of two mysterious figures he calls the two brothers, a doctrine which later alchemists like Ibn Yumal took up as allegory. The balances represent the theoretical culmination of Jabir's thought, tying together the worldly and the spiritual through the concept of balance. We also have the 500 books. This enormous collection, 500 treatises, is largely lost, but titles suggest it dealt with moral and religious allegories via alchemy. Jabir appears to have used these writings to expound Shiite eschatology and imamology in an alchemical metaphorical framework. For instance, one extant fragment, the Book of Kingship, survives partly in Latin, and likely used the notion of ruling kingship as an allegory for mastering nature. In these texts, the boundary between alchemy and theology blurs. Chemical symbols stand in for spiritual concepts. Unfortunately, only 15 of the 500 are existence, so we can only glimpse the depth of Jabir's mystical allegories. Next, we have the books on the 7 metals. True to the classical idea of 7 planetary metals, Jabir devoted a set of 7 treatises to the 7 known metals of antiquity: gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, lead, and possibly zinc or an alloy resembling it. Each treatise in this group discusses one metal in detail, its properties, how it can be purified or transmuted, and its role in the overall alchemical scheme. Because Jabir linked metals to planetary influences, these treatises likely also touch on astrology and cosmology as they pertain to each metal. In one manuscript tradition, the metal treatises are followed by a 3-part book of concision, which might summarize the 7 in a unified theory. The focus on the individual metals shows Jabir's almost scientific thoroughness, examining each substance on its own terms, an approach that prefigures later metallurgical science. Beyond these collections, there are many standalone works attributed to Jabir on specific aspects of alchemy. Paul Krauss, in cataloging the corpus, placed about 200 treatises in a category of diverse alchemical works which he cannot confidently assign to a particular collection. These likely include monographs on topics such as preparation of mercury, the various colors of sulfur, properties of particular compounds, and manuals on alchemical apparatuses. Some titles from this miscellaneous set are The Fire of the Stone, which suggests detailed treatises on components of the Philosopher's Stone operation. There are also texts named after legendary figures, dialogues like Questions of Khalid to Marianos the Monk, which tie Jabir's teachings to earlier alchemical legends. These diverse treatises indicate that Jabir's alchemical output was encyclopedic. If a topic or technique existed, he likely wrote about it. Many might have been instructional booklets for students in his circle, while others were theoretical musings. We do have writings on magic and the occult. Jabir's corpus also includes a subset of works that veer into magic, talismans, and hidden properties of things. These show Jabir applying his knowledge to what we would call the occult sciences. We have the Book of the Search, also known as the Book of Extracts, and it is a long treatise laying out the philosophical basis of talismanic magic, or the science of talismans. It reads like a learned discourse on how and why talismans work, invoking the ideas of astral influences and sympathies. Fascinatingly, this work cites a wide range of Greek authorities by name: Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Archimedes, Galen, and even mystical figures like Apollonius of Tyana. This demonstrates Jabir's broad understanding. He was linking his talisman theory to the legacy of Greek philosophy, perhaps to give it intellectual legitimacy. This book indicates that Jabir saw magic as a serious, quasi-scientific discipline grounded in philosophy and nature's laws. Then we have the Book of 50. Only fragments of this work remain, but it's thought to be the Great Book of Talismans under another name. From what survives, we know it discussed astrology, demonology, and specific occult properties. For example, it likely enumerated how different stars and constellations could be used in talisman making, or how certain incantations and symbolic figures might summon or repel spiritual entities, jinns, or demons. The inclusion of demonology shows Jabir ventured into areas we consider magical or supernatural. Yet, he probably approached it systematically, attempting to categorize spiritual beings and their interactions with the material world. And we also have the Great Book on Specific Properties. This is Jabir's chief work on what we might term occult properties, the hidden powers inherent in minerals, plants, and animals. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, it was believed that God placed secret virtues in natural objects. For instance, a certain stone might cure poison, a certain plant might bring good luck. Jabir compiled these secrets, effectively creating a tome of wonders and recipes: how to use a toad's bone to attract money, or which herb cures a fever when worn as an amulet, and so on. Crucially, Jabir didn't treat this as a mere folklore. He attempted to analyze these properties with the same science of the balance approach he applied elsewhere. Parts of this book include chapters that apply numerical balancing to understanding why a plant has a particular effect, thus trying to rationalize the mysterious. This work demonstrates Jabir's role as a bridge between science and magic. He collected empirical knowledge of odd effects, a proto-science of pharmacology in a way, yet framed it in a theoretical construct. And next we have the Book of the King, a short text focusing on the efficacy of talismans. It may have been a succinct guide, perhaps dedicated to a patron, the king, on how to effectively craft talismans for various purposes. It indicates Jabir could summarize his magical knowledge in digest form when needed, perhaps to advise a ruler or wealthy client on protective and beneficial charms. And finally, we have the Book of Black Magic. This ominously titled treatise stands out. Al-Jafar in Islamic context refers to a mystical compendium of knowledge. According to Shiite tradition, Al-Jafar was a secret book of Imam Ali full of esoteric lore. Calling something the Black Jafar suggests forbidden or dark knowledge. Little is known about this work beyond the title, and interestingly, no other Jabirian text references it, implying it might have been particularly secret or even apocryphal. Its inclusion in Jabir's corpus hints that he, or those writing under his name, explored the furthest edges of the occult, perhaps dealing with black magic or apocalyptic prophecy. The very fact that Jabir's legend includes a black magic manual shows how he was later seen as a master of hidden arts, both light and dark. Beyond these, Jabir was said to have written on virtually every subject known to scholars of his time. He reportedly composed on works on mechanical devices and engineering, on military technology, and on medicine and toxicology. Most of these are lost. Notably, one extant text, the Book of Poison, survives, dealing with poisons and their remedies, showing Jabir's practical side in addressing public health and safety. Another partial text, the Book of Comprehensiveness, was preserved by a later alchemist and hints at Jabir's forays into pure philosophy. In summary, few figures in history have so many works attributed to them as Jabir ibn Hayyan. Whether or not he personally wrote every word, the breadth of topics, from mystical cosmology down to recipes for dyeing cloth, reflects an ambition to unify all knowledge into a single grand worldview. Jabir is often celebrated as the father of chemistry in the Islamic tradition, and looking at his work, it's easy to see why. He approached the study of substances in a rigorous empirical way, emphasizing experimentation and quantification over superstition. Alchemy, in his hands, began to morph into chemistry. He systematically classified materials, tested reactions, and recorded methods, moving the art beyond cryptic recipes to something more like a science. Jabir did much to free alchemy from superstition and turn it into a science, one historian notes. He himself strongly advocated for hands-on experimentation. The first essential in chemistry is that you should perform practical work and conduct experiments. For he who performs not practical work nor makes experiments will never attain to the least degree of mastery, Jabir wrote, admonishing an imaginary student. But you, O my son, do experiments so that you may acquire knowledge. Scientists delight not in abundance of material, they rejoice only in the excellence of their experimental methods. By insisting on empirical proof and reproducible results, Jabir helped lay the groundwork for the scientific method long before the Renaissance. We got several key theoretical contributions that could be attributed to Jabir. Jabir expanded upon an idea from earlier Hellenistic alchemy, that all metals are composed of two primal principles, often identified with sulfur and mercury. In Jabir's view, metals formed inside the earth by the union of a sulfurous principle, which gave combustibility and color, and a mercurial principle, which gave metallic luster and fusibility. The variability of metals, lead versus iron versus gold, etc., was explained by differences in the purity and proportion of these two principles, as well as the influences of celestial bodies during their formation. For Jabir, gold was the most perfect metal because it was the result of the ideal sulfur-mercury ratio under the most favorable astrological influence. Hence, it is pure, untarnishing, and malleable. Baser metals either had an excess of sulfur, making them brittle or prone to rust, or an excess of mercury, making them too soft or volatile, or they were tainted by impurities. This theory had tremendous longevity. It remained dominant in some form up to the 17th century. Jabir's particular innovation was to integrate this with quantitative thinking. He believed one could calculate the balance of hot, cold, dry, wet, the qualities tied to sulfur and mercury, any metal, and then rebalance them to effect a transmutation. In a way, this was an early attempt to a chemical formula for metals. It's worth noting that in later European alchemy, a third principle, salt, was added to this theory, but that development post-dates Jabir, though some credit Jabir's Latin persona, Gerber, for hints of it. Perhaps Jabir's most original contribution is what he called the science of the balance. He sought to reduce all qualitative phenomena to quantitative proportions. To do this, he employed arithmology, numerology, assigning numbers to the letters of substance names and then manipulating those numbers. For example, the Arabic word for a substance could be broken down into letters, each letter corresponding to a number. Using the abjad system, where say Aleph equals 1, Ba equals 2, etc., he had rules by which these numbers would map onto the four elemental qualities. The total would yield a signature number, often aiming for 17 or multiples of 17, which indicated the balance of the substance's nature. If the numbers didn't add up ideally, that meant the substance was out of balance and could perhaps be perfected by adding something with complementary numbers. This was an almost mystical mathematics of chemistry. For instance, if copper's hotness came out to a certain value and gold's to another, one could deduce how much hot quality to add or subtract via mixing with other substances to push copper toward gold. Jabir's belief in a mathematically structured order of nature was prescient. In effect, he was groping towards the idea that properties of matter could be measured and predicted, a cornerstone of modern science. Although the specifics of his numerology were fantastical, the underlying insight that chemistry is quantitative was spot on. In line with his Shiite philosophical background, Jabir held that everything in creation has a hidden inner reality and an outward appearance. In practical terms, this means that observable properties like color or hardness are just the surface. Beneath them are hidden qualities and structures which the alchemist must infer. For example, lead and gold might look different, but inwardly they could share a similar mercurial core, differing only in the proportion of sulfur. This concept validated the idea that through the right processes, one could reveal the latent perfection in a base metal. Essentially, turn lead into gold by drawing out its hidden nobility. The hidden manifest dichotomy also applied to medicine, the apparent symptoms versus the hidden cause of disease, and to just about everything. It gave Jabir a philosophical justification to pursue transformations. If you understand the hidden nature through the science of balance, you can change the outward form. This idea resonates with later alchemical and even mystical thought, the notion of an inner essence awaiting enlightenment or purification. Jabir was the first to present a systematic classification of materials in chemical terms. He divided all substances into three broad categories. First, we have spirits, substances that volatilize completely in fire. They evaporate or sublime instead of melting. In Jabir's list, these included compounds like sulfur, mercury, arsenic, and even camphor. These were considered to have a gaseous or spiritual nature. They easily escape and are thus hard to calcine. Jabir wrote that a very hot fire will drive these spirits off before it can affect them. Hence, special techniques like sublimation must be used to purify spirits. And next we have metals, substances that can melt and are malleable, capable of being hammered into shape and usually possessing a metallic luster and sound. This category comprised the 7 recognized metals: gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, lead, and the semi-legendary carcini. Metals were characterized by a solid, fixed nature. They do not evaporate in fire, except mercury, but rather melt and can be cast. Jabir's entire sulfur-mercury theory revolves around explaining the differences among these metal substances. And then we have stones or bodies, substances that are earthly, neither malleable nor completely volatile. These might crack or calcine in fire rather than melt or sublime. Essentially, this is the rest of the mineral world. Rocks, salts, minerals like malachite or lapis lazuli, which might be fusible or infusible but generally are brittle and can be pulverized. Many of these stones were used in alchemy as sources of specific ingredients. They were seen as intermediate between pure metals and pure spirits, often containing mixtures of both. This tripartite classification was a major improvement over the ad hoc listings of earlier alchemical texts. It shows Jabir's drive to organize knowledge. In fact, this scheme persisted. Later Islamic and European alchemists adopted similar classifications. Our modern terms, mineral, vegetable, animal, for categories of substances is somewhat analogous, though Jabir's system was more chemically orientated. By identifying common behaviors, volatile versus fusible versus neither, Jabir helped future chemists think in terms of categories like acids, metals, salts, and so on. The concept of spirits even prefigures the idea of volatile solvents or gases in chemistry. One of Jabir's great contributions was to document and possibly invent many laboratory techniques still fundamental to chemistry. He either developed or refined methods of distillation, sublimation, calcination, crystallization, solution, filtration, amalgamation, and evaporation. For example, Jabir described how to calcine metals, heat them strongly to make oxides, and also noted that spirits like sulfur or mercury cannot sustain calcination but instead need gentler heating, which he identified as sublimation for mercury and similar substances. He gave step-by-step instructions on purifying chemicals, how to wash, filter, and decant solutions to remove impurities. He also carefully detailed the apparatus needed: designs of furnaces for achieving different temperatures, the use of closed vessels for controlled heating, and more. Jabir is often credited with either inventing or improving the alembic, the classic distillation vessel consisting of a flask and a condensing head. The Arabic word al-anbik, from Greek ambix, gives us the English alembic. Jabir's writings include illustrations or descriptions of alembics and aludels, sublimation pots, and he explained how to perform distillation by descent, distilling substances that decomposed if heated directly by heating them in a top vessel so vapors travel downward. He even cautioned how to avoid breaking glassware by heating gently, using hot ash baths, for delicate distillations, showing a very practical understanding of apparatus. Furthermore, Jabir built a precise balance. Sources say his balance could weigh items as little as 1/6480th of a kilogram, which is roughly 0.15 grams. This precision was unheard of in his time. In sum, Jabir established a repertoire of lab equipment, a kind of medieval lab manual that greatly influenced later Islamic laboratories in places like Baghdad and Cairo. Scholars like al-Razi, a century later, followed Jabir's techniques almost verbatim, and through translations, these methods became standard in European alchemy also. Jabir's experimental genius is evident in the number of substances he isolated or identified for the first time. He is credited with discovering strong mineral acids by using chemical reactions. By mixing sulfates, like iron sulfate, with certain salts and heating, he produced sulfuric acid in a crude form. Though medieval records are murky, later Islamic sources like al-Razi knew sulfuric acid as oil of vitriol, possibly building on Jabir's work. More clearly, Jabir devised ways to make hydraulic acid and nitric acid, the two other major mineral acids. He found that heating common salt, sodium chloride, with clay and vitriol released a pungent vapor, HC1 gas, which dissolved in water to give a strong acid. He also obtained nitric acid by heating saltpeter with vitriols or alum. Jabir might not have had names for these acids as we do, but he knew their properties. He famously combined the two to create aqua regia, the fabled mixture that can dissolve gold. Aqua regia, or royal water, was so named because it dissolved the king of metals, gold. Jabir's preparation of it was a milestone. Later alchemists considered aqua regia a key tool in the quest for transmutation, and it's still used by modern alchemists to dissolve noble metals. Jabir also distilled vinegar to concentrate acetic acid, essentially making a stronger vinegar, for use as a solvent. He was familiar with citric acid from lemons and tartaric acid from grape residue, using them in recipes. Beyond acids, Jabir identified and purified many salts and metal compounds. He worked with ammonium chloride, using it to help volatilize metals, a unique property that made it a secret key in alchemy. He clearly knew arsenic and its sulfide compounds, which he called zarnic, and used them as colorants and reagents. He mentions alkali, distinguishing between sodium and potassium compounds in ashes, and knew how to make caustic soda by mixing alkali with lime. He also used manganese dioxide in glass making to remove color, a technique still in use. It makes glass clear. He was aware of the poisonous nature of arsenic and mercury compounds, spurring him to write about poisons and their antidotes in his toxicology texts. All these show that Jabir systematically experimented with substances, observing their reactions. In doing so, He either discovered or rigorously documented compounds that would form the basis of practical chemistry in both the medieval and early modern periods. Unlike some purely theoretical alchemists, Jabir was very interested in the practical and industrial uses of chemistry. His writings contain recipes that would have been of great value to craftsmen. He described how to produce better metals and alloys. For instance, he gives methods for refining metals and for preparing steel from iron, recognizing the importance of carbon in iron. Even if he didn't name it, he knew different treatments gave harder or softer iron. He provided formulas for metal coatings and preservatives. Jabir explained how to make varnishes to coat iron and protect it from rust, an early form of rust proofing. He also dealt with dyeing textiles and leather, giving chemical recipes to achieve long-lasting colors. In fact, he mentions a substance to help dyes bind to cloth, essentially describing a mordant technique. In glassmaking, Jabir wrote about adding manganese to glass to remove its greenish tint, a trick still used in glass manufacturing today. He also had a method for making transparent, nearly unbreakable glass, perhaps an early attempt at tempered glass or a commentary on something like the legendary flexible glass. He worked on inorganic pigments and inks. Jabir gives recipes for cheap illuminating ink for manuscripts, likely using soot or galena. He also experimented with paints and dyes, possibly identifying compounds like lead white or verdigris for coloring. In the realm of fire and explosives, while long before gunpowder's invention, Jabir did toy with combustible and reactive mixtures. Some suggest he understood aspects of nitrate-based reactions, though there's no clear evidence he made an explosive powder. But his knowledge of vigorous acid reactions and metal dissolution laid groundwork that later, in the 13th century, would lead to nitro compounds. Jabir's interests including improving practical products like waterproofing cloth and manufacturing hair dye and healing concoctions. Being a pharmacist's son and a physician, he naturally integrated chemistry with medicine. Taken together, these achievements showed Jabir to be a figure of astonishing versatility. He was simultaneously a theorist, devising grand unifying concepts like the balance, and an experimenter, discovering new substances and inventing useful products. It's worth noting that some of the accomplishments credited to Jabir in later European texts were long thought by Western historians to belong to a much later era, until closer study confirmed that Jabir's Arabic works indeed contained the seeds of those discoveries. For example, the preparation of aqua regia was first clearly described in the Latin Summa Perfectionis, Pseudo-Gerber, 13th century, but Jabir's own Arabic recipe from centuries earlier was eventually found. This continuity underscores a direct transmission of knowledge from Jabir's lab in 8th century Kufa to the Latin alchemists of 13th century Europe. One almost prophetic idea attributed to Jabir is his speculation about the immense energy locked in matter's smallest parts. In one text, he writes, "In the smallest part of matter, the invisible particle or atom, there is an intense power. It cannot be definitively said that this small particle cannot be divided further. It, too, can be split. In what it is, such a force is released that it could overturn the world." This statement, if indeed from Jabir, is ahead of its time, essentially imagining nuclear energy over 1,000 years before its realization. Whether Jabir arrived at this through philosophical reasoning about infinite divisibility or through some experiment, perhaps observing the vigorous reaction of, say, a tiny amount of powder causing a big effect, it speaks to his intuitive genius. It also aligns with his belief in hidden properties. Even the smallest speck of matter hides a potent secret within. Jabir was not only a man of science, but also a man of faith and mysticism. In the 8th century Islamic times, the divides we now draw between science, magic, and spirituality were much more fluid. Jabir's life and writings exemplify this fluidity. He was a devout Muslim, specifically aligned with Shiite Islam, and his scientific endeavors were often tinged with spiritual purpose. In many later sources, Jabir is honorifically called al-Sufi, the mystic, suggesting he was associated with ascetic or Sufi practices. While Sufi could also mean simply wool wearer, ascetic, at the time, the implication is that Jabir approached the world as a mystic scientist, seeking not just material outcomes but also enlightenment. Being a disciple of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq deeply influenced Jabir's outlook. The Shiite view venerated the Imams as repositories of divine knowledge, including secret sciences. Jabir portrays himself as a transmitter of the Imam's wisdom. Indeed, within the Jabirian corpus are some of the earliest explicit Shiite theological teachings outside of purely religious texts. For example, in Jabir's work, Book of the Glorious and Book of Explication, we find discussions of resurrection, salvation, and the spiritual authority of the Imams, all done in allegorical form. One could read some of Jabir's alchemical metaphors as coded references to the Imams. For instance, the idea of a hidden perfect element that can transmute the world might parallel the hidden Imam, the Mahdi, who will transform society. The correspondence is not accidental. It appears Jabir, or the later compilers of his works, intentionally wove Imami doctrines into the fabric of his science. This made his alchemy a kind of sacred science, part of a holistic spiritual worldview. It also offered protection in an era when overt Shiite teachings could be politically dangerous. Embedding them in an alchemical treatise was a way to preserve and transmit esoteric religious ideas under the radar. In this sense, Jabir can be seen as a proto-Ismaili philosopher, blending Greek philosophy, alchemy, and Shiite theology, an approach that would fully blossom in the Ismaili Fatimid circles a century or two later. Jabir's alchemy was never just about metals. It was about perfection and purification, concepts as much moral as physical. In the introduction to the Book of Mercy, as we saw, he speaks in ethical terms, decrying deceit and ignorance, and championing knowledge and truth. This moral undertone runs through his works. Many alchemical texts of Jabir draw on an analogy between purifying base metals into gold and purifying the human soul. To transmute lead into gold, the alchemist himself must exhibit purity of intention, patience, and wisdom, essentially transmuting his own soul from baseness to nobility. Such ideas later became explicit in Sufi alchemical symbolism. Jabir was a pioneer of this outlook. He often warns that only the worthy, those who submit to God's will and seek knowledge righteously, will grasp the ultimate secrets. He likely saw his work as a way of glorifying God by uncovering the marvels of creation, a sentiment consistent with the Quranic encouragement to ponder Allah's signs in the world. In Jabir's time, what we call occultism was usually considered a legitimate branch of knowledge. Astrology, for example, was often studied alongside astronomy. The making of talismans was a craft akin to medicine. Jabir excelled in these areas. He did not draw a hard line between alchemy and magic. Instead, he considered magic as employing the hidden properties God placed in the universe. In the works like the Book of the Search and the Book of 50, he lays down principles for how symbols, planetary timings, and materials can be combined to channel cosmic forces. This is essentially theurgy, working with divine, quasi-divine forces. Jabir's frequent references to the stars and to spiritual beings show he believed in an animated cosmos. The stars influence the earth. Angels or spirits might mediate those influences, and through proper knowledge, a wise person could leverage these connections. Jabir's Book of Black Magic, although obscure, hints that he even explored what others shunned, possibly necromancy or dark sorcery. The title employs Al-Jafar, which in Shiite lore was a secret text of Imam Ali, containing apocalyptic and mystical knowledge. The black qualifier might mean forbidden knowledge. By contrast, some speak of a white Jafar for permissible secrets and a black Jafar for forbidden ones. This aligns with Jabir's method for scattering knowledge in riddles. Perhaps the darkest secrets were only hinted at in this lost work. We don't know its contents, but later legends grew that Jabir could perform miraculous feats, turning aside the evil eye, summoning jinn, or creating life in flasks. While these sound like fairy tales, they do echo experiments he actually discussed. One vivid anecdote illustrating Jabir's ethical stance on magic is his criticism of frauds who claim to transmute metals by superficial tricks. Both Jabir and later Islamic scholars wrote against dishonest alchemists who merely plated cheap metal to look like gold. Jabir's compassion for the deceived seekers suggests he saw misuse of alchemy and magic as morally reprehensible. He strove to distance himself from the image of the charlatan sorcerer and present himself as a God-fearing sage unveiling the creative secret for the benefit of humankind. Over time, many stories grew around Jabir that blur reality and legend, painting him as almost a wizard. One story claims that Jabir could create a homunculus, a tiny artificial life form, in his laboratory. While this sounds fantastical, it's based on a section of the Jabirian corpus that discusses the takwin, or artificial generation of living creatures. Another legend says that Jabir once saved his patron from an assassination by poisoning by having secretly coated the target's cup with an alchemical antidote, thus displaying his mastery over poisons. Whether true or not, it ties into the fact that he did write on poisons and cures. It is also said that after the Barmakids fell and Jabir was under house arrest, he feigned madness or incompetence to avoid suspicion, all while writing his most profound works in secret. For example, Ibn al-Nadim relates that Jabir wrote books on the order of reading my books, now lost, to guide his disciples through the labyrinth of knowledge. This suggests Jabir had a circle of students who carried on his teachings covertly. Indeed, some modern scholars propose that Jabir might actually represent a whole school of alchemists who used Jabir as a pen name. In that scenario, the legend of Jabir's personal life could be allegories of a group working in secrecy. Notably, Jabir's writings themselves acknowledge the deliberate use of obfuscation and cryptography. He famously describes a technique called dispersion of knowledge, where the author splits up a single discourse into separate parts across different chapters or books, so that no one piece reveals the full secret. This way, only a persistent and wise student who reads all and puts it together can grasp the truth, shielding it from the uninitiated. Jabir employs this throughout his corpus. For instance, a crucial instruction for an elixir might be tucked into a treatise that appears to be about grammar. This scattering of the truth was later admired and emulated by European occultists like Heinrich Agrippa in the Renaissance. The very fact Jabir emphasizes this shows his mystical mindset. Truth is a treasure to be protected. Revelation should be gradual, almost initiatory. It paints the picture of Jabir not just as a scientist, but as a master of wisdom, almost a secret society guru, guiding select disciples to enlightenment under layers of symbol and cipher. In summary, Jabir's identity as a scholar cannot be separated from his identity as a mystic and believer. He lived when seeking knowledge was a form of worship. Understanding God's creation was a way to appreciate God. His teacher, Jafar al-Sadiq, is said to have taught him the true knowledge, him as an inner light that God grants to the sincere. Jabir's life work, from the pursuit of the elixir to the crafting of talismans, was ultimately aimed at harnessing that light, both in the material world and within the self. As he once wrote, "The purpose of our work is to remove darkness from the mind and bring forth light." In this spirit, the archetype of Jabir, in later lore, became a beacon of the marriage between science and spirituality, a tradition that profoundly influenced Islamic esoteric thought and, through translation, even European alchemical mysticism. After the downfall of his patrons in 803 CE, Jabir lived quietly in Kufa, likely under the watchful eye of the authorities. Cut off from court life and worldly ambitions, Jabir devoted himself to organizing and recording his vast knowledge. It may have been during these final years, 803 to 815, that he compiled many of the treaties we now have, revising earlier notes and ensuring his legacy would survive. Some sources say he purposely hid copies of his works in various spots. There is a story that a copy of the Kitab al-Rama was found hidden in a wall in Kufa generations later. This resonates with his covert style. He wanted the knowledge to outlast him, even if he wasn't there to teach it. Jabir died roughly 94 years old, around 815 CE in Kufa. There is little fanfare recorded about his passing. Considering the tense politics, it might have been a quiet funeral. Perhaps a few devout students attended to bury their master, keeping his secrets even as they laid him to rest. There's no famous tomb or shrine for Jabir. In contrast to many luminaries of his time, he faded from public record at death. This low-profile end befitted someone whom history remembers as somewhat enigmatic and hidden. Yet, ironically, within a few decades after his death, Jabir's name rose to great prominence in intellectual circles. By the 10th century, scholars in Baghdad and elsewhere were avidly discussing Jabir's books. Some question whether these writings were truly by one man or were too many and too varied to be authentic. As mentioned, a few skeptics even claimed Jabir ibn Hayyan was a fictitious figure concocted to house a body of allegorical writings. But the prevailing view among Islamic bibliophiles was that Jabir was real, a great savant of the past, though one whose life was deliberately obscured. This aura of mystery only added to his allure. In a sense, Jabir ibn Hayyan the legend was just beginning as Jabir the man ended. Over the next centuries, many would claim to be the heirs of Jabir's knowledge, and his name would travel far beyond the streets of Kufa. The impact of Jabir on subsequent history is immense, spanning the domains of science, medicine, philosophy, and even culture. Here, we will talk about some key aspects of his legacy. Jabir's most celebrated legacy is the founding figure of chemistry as a science. While modern chemistry evolved long after him, historians acknowledge Jabir's work as laying critical groundwork. The 19th century French chemist Marcellin Berthelot remarked that Jabir ibn Hayyan in chemistry is like Aristotle in logic, meaning that Jabir's writings systemized the field in a way that became a reference point for centuries. Indeed, Jabir's texts contain the earliest known systematic classification of substances and reactions. He was among the first to emphasize quantitative experimentation, inspiring later scholars to follow suit. European historians like Eric John Halmayard and William R. Newman have credited Jabir with crucial innovations that helped transform alchemy into chemistry. It is no exaggeration that Francis Bacon, the 17th century English philosopher, wrote, "Jabir ibn Hayyan was the first who taught the world the art of chemistry. Thus, he is the father of chemistry." Many modern references, textbooks, and encyclopedias echo this by dubbing him the father of Arab chemistry, or simply the father of chemistry. While one can debate the exact moment chemistry was born, there is no doubt Jabir accelerated its maturation. His introduction of controlled experiment, precise apparatus, and clear documentation of outcomes is a legacy every chemist today is unknowingly indebted to. Within the Islamic Golden Age, Jabir's influence was profound. He became the master alchemist whom later alchemists revered. In the 9th century, the renowned polymath Al-Razi built on Jabir's work. Razi's own writings on alchemy and acid show concepts and techniques pioneered by Jabir. Razi even referenced to Jabir as the teacher in his works and frequently cites him, indicating the continuity of the tradition. By the 10th century, Al-Farabi and others list alchemy among sciences and name Jabir as its chief exponent. The 11th century scholar Ibn Sina, while skeptical of physical transmutation, nonetheless engaged with Jabir's ideas and felt the need to critique those who followed Jabir's quest for artificial gold, a sign of how widespread Jabir's influence was. Ibn Khaldun, the great 14th century historian, noted that in his time alchemy was called the science of Jabir, and that Jabir's 70 epistles on alchemy were well known but so cryptic that they had spawned countless commentaries. This is telling. A medieval intellectual like Ibn Khaldun, writing on the history of sciences, felt Jabir's contributions were so fundamental that the entire field was linked to him. Muslim alchemists, up to the 15th century, saw themselves as footnotes to Jabir, elaborating on his methods or trying to decode his puzzles. Jabir's work also influenced adjacent fields. For example, his classification of substances and emphases on experimentation spilled over into medicine and pharmacology. Pharmacists adopted chemical methods to prepare remedies following Jabir's demonstrations. Jabir's writings first reached Europe in translated Latin forms in the High Middle Ages. As mentioned, Gerard of Cremona translated the Book of 70 into Latin in the 12th century. Translations of the Book of Mercy and some other treatises were also made into Latin. European scholars latched onto the Latinized name Geber, Geber, as the author of these works. Geber gained an almost mythical authority among Western alchemists. He was often referred to as the wise Geber or the master. In fact, the European alchemists so adored Geber that in the late 13th century an enterprising and anonymous author wrote a set of influential alchemical texts in Latin and falsely attributed them to Geber to lend them credibility. The author is known today as Pseudo-Geber, and his most famous work, The Sum of Perfection of the Magistery, was for centuries thought to be by the real Jabir. The Sum of Perfection, likely written by Paul of Taranto around 1260 to 1270, the book built upon Jabir's sulfur-mercury theory but introduced new ideas like a corpuscular theory of matter and a clearer lab process for producing the Philosopher's Stone. The fact that Pseudo-Geber felt the need to attribute his work to Jabir shows the esteem of Jabir's name. The fact that Pseudo-Geber felt the need to attribute his work to Jabir shows the esteem of Jabir's name. Through these Latin works, Jabir's influence permeated the Renaissance. Paracelsus knew of Geber, Roger Bacon cited Geber's findings, and some say Bacon obtained some recipes from Jabir's texts. And later alchemists like Robert Boyle in the 17th century still referenced Geber's theories. Even the terminology in chemistry owes Jabir. Words like alembic, alkali, and elixir came through Arabic into European languages due to Jabir's writings. Interestingly, the word gibberish is speculated by some to derive from Geberish, meaning the kind of unintelligible jargon people thought Geber's alchemical recipes sounded like. Whether true or not, it's a colorful testament to how famous and arcane Jabir and Geber's texts were considered. While Jabir himself wasn't a literary figure, his persona as the archetypal wise alchemist had seeped into cultural works over the ages. In the Islamic world, alchemy was often a theme in poetry and tales. For instance, some stories in the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, occur in Harun al-Rashid's court. One could imagine that among the backdrop characters might be an alchemist reminiscent of Jabir. Indeed, Jabir is sometimes name-dropped in later Arabic stories as the sage who knew the secrets of alchemy. Sufi poets like Jalaluddin Rumi and Hafiz used alchemical metaphors extensively, turning copper to gold as a symbol of inner transformation, the elixir as divine love. And while they don't mention Jabir explicitly, they inherit that language from the Islamic alchemical tradition he helped forge. In Western culture, Jabir, as Geber, appeared in various alchemical treatises and was sometimes referenced in literature of the Romantic era that had occult leanings. For example, in Washington Irving's Tale of the Alhambra, there are passing references to ancient alchemists and the quest for the Philosopher's Stone that hark back to Geber. In more recent times, Jabir has been explicitly portrayed in some historical novels and television series. A 2005 Iranian TV miniseries titled Jabir ibn Hayyan dramatized his life as a student of Imam Jafar, highlighting his scientific and spiritual endeavors. Educational programs and documentaries in the Middle East often include segments on Jabir when discussing the Golden Age of Islam. Even in fiction, the archetype of an alchemist named Geber pops up occasionally in fantasy novels or games as a nod to the historical Jabir. These cultural depictions sometimes take liberties, like imbuing Jabir with magical powers, but they serve to keep his memory alive outside of academic context. Jabir has essentially become a symbol of the fusion of science and magic. The wizard alchemist in his laboratory, a trope that has inspired countless fictional characters. Jabir's integration of spiritual ideas with science left a mark on religious thought as well. Within Shiite Islam, Jabir is sometimes regarded as an example of how the Imam's knowledge extended to worldly sciences. There's a pride in Shiite narratives that a disciple of Imam Jafar contributed so much to human knowledge, reinforcing the belief that the Imams were true fonts of knowledge since they taught people like Jabir. Additionally, Jabir's approach influenced Islamic esoteric philosophies like those of the Brethren of Purity in the 10th century, who wrote an encyclopedic set of epistles combining science, Neoplatonism, and Islamic theology. They likely knew of Jabir's works and adopted a similar holistic approach. In the Ismaili sect, there was an understanding that certain sciences had hidden truths. Jabir's balance and letter number mysticism tie into Ismaili cosmological numerology. Moving forward, alchemy itself took on a spiritual dimension in many religious and occult traditions. European Rosicrucians and Freemasons in the 17th and 18th centuries often looked back to figures like Hermes Trismegistus and Geber as heralds of ancient wisdom. The idea that material alchemy was a cover for spiritual alchemy, popular in both Sufi and Western esoteric thought, can in part be traced to Jabir's style of writing and thinking, where achieving gold was as much about enlightenment as it was about wealth. In modern New Age spirituality, one finds references to Geber's alchemy in discussions of inner transformation. Thus, Jabir indirectly lives on as a saint of science in Islamic memory and as a legendary master in occult circles. In the modern era, Jabir has continued to fascinate researchers. One of the most important academic investigations was by Paul Krauss in the 1930s. Krauss analyzed the Jabirian corpus linguistically and historically, and concluded that the bulk of it could not have been written in the 8th century, pointing instead to the 9th, 10th century Ismaili times. Krauss suggested that Jabir might have been a pseudonym for an entire esoteric fraternity. While this shocked some, as it implied Jabir ibn Hayyan, as traditionally conceived, might be a later construct, it has since gained ground that the corpus is heterogeneous, with layers from different times. Still, Krauss did not deny the existence of a historical Jabir. He believed an original core of works, perhaps including the Book of Mercy and a few others, could stem from the real Jabir, around which a school accredited more writings. Later scholars like E.G. Halmayard also wrote about Jabir, often in more reverent tones, crediting him personally with many discoveries. Syed Hassan Nasser and others highlighted Jabir's role in the Islamic scientific spirit. More recently, William R. Newman re-examined Jabir's influence on the West, clarifying what was genuine and what was pseudo-Geber, which helped restore proper credit to the historical Jabir for certain innovations. Academic interest also extends to the content analysis of Jabir's work. For example, scholars study his use of Arabic language and technical terms, his citation of earlier sources, and his impact on subsequent scientific vocabulary. In the Arab world, researchers publish papers in Arabic and English reassessing Jabir's contributions, often with a tone of reclaiming a proud heritage, pointing out that Jabir understood the necessity of experimentation long before Francis Bacon formalized it. In sum, Jabir remains a subject of active scholarly exploration, a bridge connecting the ancient, medieval, and modern scientific traditions. Jabir ibn Hayyan's life and legacy form a rich tapestry. He lived in a time when knowledge was a grand adventure, when one could be a theologian, chemist, philosopher, and magician all at once. Through dedication and intellect, Jabir became a figure larger than life. The poor orphan of Tus, who might have learned in secret from an imam, who healed the sick in Kufa and experimented under the patronage of a caliph, who suffered political fall but turned inward to write an opus of knowledge, and who after death was revered as the sage Geber across the world. His biography, filled with both historical fact and mythical embellishment, captures the imagination. And his work, from the practical recipes for acids to the mystical numerology of the balance, symbolizes the union of mind and spirit characteristic of the golden age of Islamic civilization. Over a millennium later, whenever we mix chemicals in a lab, or speak of elements in balance, or even muse about the spiritual metaphor of turning lead into gold, Jabir's echoes are with us. As the Imam Jafar is reported to have said to Jabir, "Knowledge is life's adornment and the key to all locked things," a creed Jabir ibn Hayyan exemplified to the fullest by unlocking nature's secrets and adorning history with his knowledge. His legacy in science and mysticism continues to shine, as pure and enduring as the gold he sought to create. If alchemy is the art of perfecting the imperfect, Jabir's life is at its plainest proof. He took base materials, loss, exile, suspicion, and refined them into a method where measurement meets meaning. Whether you meet him as a student, physician, or veiled master scattering truths across books, he keeps asking the same thing. Will you weigh the unseen as carefully as you weigh the seen? That's why he belongs on the Occult Rejects. Not as a relic, but as a mirror. And I hope you all enjoyed this one. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.